Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into something today that I think is super important for, well, pretty much any business owner out there, especially if you're running a small to mid-sized operation.
Mm-hmm.
And that is how to classify your workers.
Yeah.
Specifically, we're talking about the difference between W-2 employees and 1099 contractors.
Right.
Now, trust me, getting this right, it can be a lot more important than you might think.
Oh, absolutely. Misclassifying workers.
Yeah.
It can lead to a whole bunch of problems you don't want.
Yeah. Like what kind of problems are we talking about?
Well, you could be looking at back taxes, fines, even legal issues.
Oof, that's not good.
Not good at all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always super clear who fits in which category, especially these days with the gig economy exploding and all these new ways that people are working.
It really is changing fast.
For sure.
So that's what we're here to break down today.
Absolutely. We're going to look at the key differences between these two categories. W-2 employees and 1099 contractors. Look at some real-world examples so you can see how it works in practice.
And of course, give you some really practical tips to make sure that you're staying on the right side of the law.
That's the goal.
And to add to that, I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about how the gig economy is kind of changing the game.
Yeah.
It's like throwing a wrench into the whole classification system.
For sure.
And I'd love to get your take on what that means for the future of work.
Absolutely. Happy to dive into that.
Awesome. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty here.
Okay.
So when we talk about W-2 employees, we're talking about the folks who are, kind of the backbone of your company.
Yeah, the core team.
Exactly. They're on your payroll.
Mm-hmm.
You deduct taxes from their paychecks. You're responsible for providing them with certain benefits like health insurance, paid time off, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And one of the biggest things that sets those W-2 employees apart is how much control the employer has over their work.
Right.
You get to decide, generally, when and where and how they do their jobs. You give them the tools, you set the schedule, and you even have a say in the methods they use to do the work.
I see.
A classic example would be, let's say, a construction worker on a building site. The company provides all their equipment,
Right.
dictates their work hours, and directly supervises the tasks they're doing.
Okay, so that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Now let's flip the script and talk about 1099 contractors.
Okay.
These guys are a little different, right?
That's
They're
right.
more like independent operators, almost like running their own mini businesses.
Yeah, you got it.
They handle their own taxes, usually get paid per project or on a contract basis.
Yeah, think of like a freelance graphic designer.
Okay.
Works with a bunch of different clients, different projects.
Right.
Sets their own hours, uses their own software, their own equipment,
Uh-huh.
and they have a lot more autonomy in how they get the work done.
So I'm starting to get the difference here.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you actually figure out
Yeah.
whether someone should be a W-2 employee or a 1099 contractor? Because it feels like there could be some gray areas there.
You're right, there can be.
Yeah.
And that's where things can get a little tricky, especially with all these new gig economy jobs popping up.
It's definitely a whole new world out there.
That's why the IRS came up with this thing called the right to control test.
Okay, the right to control test. Tell me more.
All right, well, this test helps employers and the IRS, of course, figure out if a worker is an employee or a contractor. And it boils down to three main things: behavioral control,
Okay.
financial control,
Uh-huh.
and the type of relationship.
Okay, those sound pretty broad. Can you break those down a little bit more for me?
Absolutely. So behavioral control basically looks at how much, say, the company has in how the work gets done.
Gotcha. Kind of like what we were talking about before.
Exactly. Like, do they train the worker? Do they provide specific instructions?
Right.
Things like that. Then you've got financial control.
Okay.
And that's all about how the worker gets paid, who's providing the tools and materials, whether they can incur expenses that the company reimburses, that kind of stuff.
So it sounds like if the company is calling most of the shots,
Yeah,
it's probably looking more like an employment relationship.
exactly. And then the last piece of the puzzle, the type of relationship,
Right.
that looks at things like written contracts, whether the person gets benefits,
I see.
and if the work is ongoing or just for a specific project.
Makes sense.
So, for instance, if someone is getting benefits like health insurance or paid time off,
Yeah.
that usually points towards an employee relationship.
Okay, this is really helpful, but I'm thinking about all the small business owners out there
Yeah.
who might be feeling a little overwhelmed with all this.
Yeah.
It's a lot to keep straight.
It really is. It definitely is. And that's why having those clear written contracts It's so important.
Right.
It doesn't matter if it's a W-2 employee or a 1099 contractor.
Right.
Having everything spelled out in black and white,
Yep.
it can really help prevent some big misunderstandings down the road.
Totally. It's like that safety net you were talking
Exactly.
about. Now, what happens if a business owner, they get it wrong?
Yeah.
What are the consequences of misclassifying a worker?
Well, let me tell you, it can get pretty messy.
Yeah.
We're talking about back taxes, penalties, even lawsuits from workers who say, hey, I was misclassified.
Yeah.
And the IRS, the Department of Labor,
Right.
they do not mess around with this stuff.
So you really got to be careful.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you give us like a real life example of how this might actually play out?
Sure. Imagine a tech startup, right?
Okay.
They hire a bunch of software developers to work on a project,
Okay.
and they classify them as 1099 contractors.
Got it.
Because it's just, for this one project, it's time limited.
Yeah.
The developers, they've got a lot of flexibility. They can kind of manage their own work.
Makes sense.
But then the project gets extended,
No.
and the company starts saying, okay, you got to work these hours,
Right.
and we're going to start providing you with equipment.
Oh, so the lines get blurry.
Exactly. And then later on, those developers, they could say, hey, wait a minute, we were actually employees this whole time.
Right.
And if they file a claim,
Oh, boy.
that company could be in big trouble.
Yeah.
They might owe unpaid payroll taxes, overtime pay, benefits they never gave.
Yeah, that's like the nightmare scenario.
It is, especially for a small business.
Especially a small business that doesn't have a lot of resources to fight a legal battle.
Exactly. And that's where those gray areas we were talking about,
Yeah.
they become a real problem, especially with the whole rise of the gig economy.
That's right. We touched on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
So how is the gig economy really changing this whole employee versus contractor thing?
Well, it's really shaking things up.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got platforms like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash.
Right.
And they're built on connecting businesses with people who are freelancing or contracting.
Right.
But are those people actually independent contractors?
Yeah, that's the question.
Or are they employees?
It's a big debate.
It's a huge debate. And that's why we're seeing all these court cases and legislation popping up all over the country.
Trying to figure it all out.
Exactly. Some states are even thinking about new laws,
Wow.
specifically for worker classification in the gig economy.
That's interesting. So it's almost like the law is trying to catch up to the way work is changing.
You could definitely say that.
Yeah.
And for businesses, what this means,
Yeah.
it's more important than ever to stay informed.
Right.
You got to keep up with what's happening legally.
Yeah.
Understand that right to control test we talked about.
Mhm.
And think about how these evolving definitions of what an employee is, how that's going to affect your business.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. It can be overwhelming.
So any advice for businesses who are trying to navigate all this?
Well, the best thing you can do
Yeah.
is get some guidance
Okay.
from HR professionals who really specialize in this area.
So the experts?
The experts, exactly.
Makes sense.
They can look at your specific situation, make sure your contracts are good. Right.
And give you the best advice on how to classify your workers.
Okay, so sometimes you just got to call in the cavalry.
You got it. And for those of you listening in Texas,
Right.
there's this fantastic firm that I've actually worked with a few times called the Unit Consulting.
They're really great. Yeah, I've heard good things about them, especially when it comes to helping those small to mid-sized businesses
Yeah.
navigate the whole HR world.
Absolutely. They really know their stuff.
Yeah.
Especially in Texas, they've got a deep understanding of the employment laws there,
Mm-hmm.
and they can give you advice on just about anything.
Wow.
Worker classification, making sure you're compliant with state and federal regulations, the whole 9 yards.
So it sounds like if you're in Texas and you're feeling a little lost with all this HR stuff,
Yeah.
the Unit Consulting is definitely the place to go.
For sure. They can help you stay on track, avoid those costly mistakes we talked about,
Right.
and get back to focusing on what really matters, running your business.
That's what it's all about.
All right. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground today.
We did.
We started with the basics of W-2 employees and 1099 contractors.
Yep.
Then we dove into that right to control test, all the details there.
All the ins and outs.
And then we even talked about how this whole gig economy is kind of turning everything on its head.
Absolutely. It's changing the game.
It really is. It's like the future of work is happening right now.
Right in front of us.
And it's not getting any simpler.
Nope. It's getting more complex, for sure.
But I think that's what makes it so interesting.
It keeps things exciting.
It does. So for everyone listening out there, remember, knowledge is power,
Absolutely.
especially when it comes to worker classification. Stay curious, keep
Yep.
learning,
Mm-hmm.
and don't be afraid to reach out to the experts when you need a little help.
Exactly. And if you're in Texas, the unit consulting,
Yes,
they're just a phone call away.
that's right.
956-230-6866.
Easy to remember.
And they would be happy to answer any questions you've got and help you create a workplace that's both compliant and thriving.
Couldn't ask for anything more. Well, that's it for today's deep dive.
That's a wrap.
We'll catch you next time for another exploration of the ever-changing world of work.
Looking forward to it.
Until then, stay informed and stay ahead of the curve.